right. Thank you everyone for coming. So I just finished my PhD this year from WASI. If anyone has any tenure track positions to offer me, please speak to me afterwards. Thank you. So this is a part of my dissertation research. I'm looking at the institutional policy level in my dissertation. So we'll start with a few quotes from Cook in 2009. From the end of the 19th century onwards, almost all influential theoretical works on language teaching have assumed without argument that a new language should be taught without reference to the student's first language. So you can kind of see the backdrop or the kind of historical aspect of SLA in that sense. This is what Ellis called the unmarked case and Gogolin a monolingual habitus. And fast forward 10 years, Macaro and colleagues, we have now reached the point where there are virtually no commentaries made in the SLA field advocating the exclusion or even the strong limitation of the L1. So quite a massive shift on the research side anyways, from kind of monolingual to more multilingual orientations. And as Lynn asserts, we would do well to question the linguistic, educational, and pedagogical implications behind the one language, one classroom pedagogical straitjacket. So a lot of work has been done in this area, including these scholars that we just mentioned, to kind of break down a hegemonic monolingual or English-only policies. But notoriously, innovations in research often take a considerable amount of time to reach the classroom, and then even maybe more so, reaching the level of policy. So when we look at some of the existing research, there's a significant body of research on medium of instruction policy, so kind of EMI in higher education. And we do have a lot of qualitative studies on institutional language policies in post-secondary ELT, which is my kind of context and focus. What we do lack is, any kind of quantitative data in this area. So I'm trying to fill this gap. For example, Prulitskaya did a survey of 194 translanguage studies in 2021 and found only 3% were quantitative and only 14% mixed. So there's kind of a gap in the research there. And so, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any large-scale investigations into institutional language policies in post-secondary ELT beyond what I'm presenting today. So again, we can talk about this kind of a litmus test of a multilingual or a plurilingual turn. So again, we've seen in the research that shift has taken place. We're seeing this kind of in the classroom level as well. Okay, but the question being, how much has that turn kind of taken place on the level of policy, and in this case, institutional policy. So again, a lot of evidence of the turn taking root at the classroom level to incorporate learners' full linguistic repertoires in language learning. And then in my study, a kind of unique cross-cultural comparison of a target language embedded context like Canada, where talking about the English language teaching, right? So where English is kind of ubiquitous outside the classroom, and a target language removed context like Japan, where it is not. So for the research design, we're focusing today on research question 1. To what extent are monolingual institutional policies still prevalent in post-secondary ELT in Canada and Japan? Important to note this is teachers' self-report, so they're reporting on their institutional policies, as opposed to me going in and finding all the policy documents. I did look at some policy documents for other purposes, but the data here is on the teacher's self-report. I used a mixed methods participant selection model, starting with a survey, a mixed method survey, and then after data cleaning had 125 total responses. And this is partially, I think, due to pandemic effects, because my data collection started right when the pandemic hit, and a lot of people were like sat in front of their computers, and so they were maybe more willing and kind of available to do an online survey, right? So that was maybe one of the affordances there. And then as far as interviews and observations, I analyzed the survey responses and then selected teachers for follow-up kind of online interviews and then observations as well. Waited for 2 years for the Japanese border to finally open, and then I got to go to Japan to collect my data, which is why it took me 7.5 years to finish my PhD. And then for data analysis, on the quant side, t-tests, ANOVAs, and Pearson correlation to look at the connections between the variables and the dimensions of Likert scales, and then thematic analysis of open-ended survey questions and interviews. So a note about the context of the research. So looking first at post-secondary ELT in Canada, which a lot of us are probably familiar with. So my sample is made up of colleges and universities, primarily in Ontario. We have a pathway and bridging program. So before university admission, trying to improve your English level, academic English level, and then undergraduate ESL programs, kind of credit programs as well. Teachers, obviously from a wide range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And the student body is somewhat linguistically heterogeneous, meaning that sometimes you'll have a class with, a mix of different nationalities, and other times it might be just, one nationality or one linguistic background. Post-secondary ELT in Japan is different. So the sample is made up of private, national, and public universities. The difference here is the national and public are publicly funded, and so they often follow the directives of the government more closely than private or kind of on their own in that sense. These are undergraduate EFL programs, so there are no pathway or bridging programs in the Japanese context. And you tend to have two types of teachers. Well, this is beginning to change, but in my sample, you'd have the local Japanese teachers of English, or you'd have foreign teachers from English-dominant countries. And it's more linguistically homogeneous as far as the student body. So most of the students are Japanese, they share the common L1, and oftentimes they share the L1 with a teacher as well. What the ELT programs in both contexts share, however, is integration of academic content, English language acquisition, kind of principles or purposes, and academic skills development. So kind of, you can see the kind of EAP aspect across both. Here's a quick map, the context of the research in both Japan and in Canada. And so we're first looking at the quantitative data. And so the survey questions here, 2 Likert scale questions. So my institution has a strict English only policy, 6-point Likert scale, or my institution allows the use of other languages in the classroom. So these were combined to create the institutional policy dimension for the Likert scales. And also a multiple choice question. How would you best describe your institution's classroom policy? Kind of strict English only, a lenient version. There is no classroom language policy. Institution allows other languages, or the institution encourages other languages in the classroom. And then other. So interestingly, here are the results. You can see that the EO refers to English only, OL to other languages. So the total sample of 63 institutions, 41 in Japan and 22 in Canada. So you can see there's a relative lack of strict English only policies at the institutional level in both Japan and Canada. This is across the entire sample, potentially evidencing a weakening of a monolingual habitus. But there's no policy at over 50% of the institutions, showing that post-secondary instructors have a level of autonomy to determine their own language policies. But a lack of evidence of plurilingualism taking hold. Notice how there's, a certain amount in the other languages allowed, but none of the institutions of the 63 actually encourage the use of other languages on the level of policy. When we parse and we look at Japan versus Canada in this sense, again, from the multiple choice question, seeming similarity across the two contexts, some smaller differences. When triangulating with the institutional policy Likert scale dimension, there's the descriptive statistics, which actually brought about a statistically significant result insofar as that the Canadian institutions were more monolingual than the Japanese ones. And this could be due to a shared L1 among students and often teachers. Also in Japan, they often follow a more traditional grammar translation method, where obviously the Japanese language is used heavily in the classroom, sometimes almost exclusively in the English language classroom. Another variable of interest that I found was looking at the credit versus non-credit. So the kind of theory was that the non-credit, the pathway bridging programs almost work like small kind of language schools. They're a bit more centralized. They might have more kind of policies. Whereas for the credit institutions, teachers are maybe a bit more autonomous. They're not kind of being managed in that sense. So you can see again, relative similarity across those measures. Looking at the N sizes for credit and non-credit, again, the relative similarity. But again, when we looked at Likert scales, much closer in the findings here. So non-credit slightly more monolingual, but not nearly statistically significant. So that kind of hypothesis that there'd be a difference there was not really substantiated. All right. Looking now at the qual data. So from the Japanese context, we saw a level of autonomy for teachers. So this triangulates Kwan on the lower prevalence of English only in Japan. For example, my institution is not dictatorial. How instructors wish to teach is up to them. Or it's something that I always emphasize when we hire a new teacher, it's that we don't have any language policy, and it's kind of in our textbook. It's fairly clear that we encourage the use of English, but we don't restrict your use of Japanese or the students' use of Japanese. And from the classroom observations, I noticed that in Japan, and regardless of the orientation of the teacher, whether they were more kind of monolingual, mixed, or more multilingual, the class content, the medium of instruction, or the level of students witnessed a considerable amount of Japanese being spoken by students in all classrooms in Japan. So this kind of ubiquity of the Japanese language in English classrooms in Japan. So English only doesn't really exist in the context, right? Because there is space for Japanese in ELT curricular spaces, for example, in grammar instruction. Translanguage often seem to be making more space for English in the classroom, as opposed to in Canada, we talk about making more space for other languages. Oops. And the ubiquity of Japanese language, the shared L1, may contribute to fewer English-only institutional policies and thus greater teacher autonomy. So we've got a few more minutes. I'm going to skip the longer quotes here. Yeah. There was also an interesting aspect of complexity of policy perception. So in Canada, and for both contexts, for institutions with multiple instructors in the sample, only 2 out of 9 in Japan and 1 out of 8 in Canada answered unanimously on question 21, that about the self-report about their institutional policies. So for example, in a pathway program in Canada, we see a shift away from strict English only over time, but these kind of remnants remain. So the teachers that reported strict English only, students had to put a quarter or a loonie in a jar every time they spoke a language other than English. Or while there's a strict policy, I do not see it being institutionally enforced outside the classroom and outside class time. So this teacher wishes that the English only policy was enforced in the hallways, for example, where he hears other teachers or other students speaking English or other languages, right? So they perceive the policy as strict, right? On the other hand, other teachers see this as lenient. Okay, this is Christine's own observation following that English only period. The new director is English as a second language speaker himself, who could often be seen in the halls conversing in his first language with the students. So we can see this kind of null policy as well, where there's a school culture or unspoken rules that govern classroom language use. So the teachers that had been around longer might perceive that there's more of a strict English only policy, which kind of was happening in the past. Newer teachers perceive the policy differently, right? So a newer teacher then perceives that there's no policy. Teachers have the autonomy to allow other languages or forbid other languages as they see fit. So we can see the institutional language policy here is not monolithic or static, revealed to the variability of instructors' perceptions. Okay, on this point, we also have this complexity in the Japanese context. I'm not going to have time to go through this part. But then we also saw resistance in the Canadian context to these English only policies. So again, this triangulates the Kwan on the higher prevalence of EO in Canada. And we see one of the participants, Clara, who sees herself as a covert plurilingual agent. So I'm highly aware of the English only policy at my institution, especially when other instructors and our supervisors are present in my classroom. I know that most of the other instructors and students believe quite strongly in this policy and enforce it in their classrooms, but I and a few other instructors do not. And this kind of covert aspect, I don't see my role right now as being an advocate in my own institution level. I prefer, probably because I still need money, to advocate in my own classroom and use my agency in the classroom. I always feel like I'm hiding, so it's weird. So we can see this top-down power of the English-only policy works to label Clara as a non-complier or a dissenter, but it's also repurposed in Clara's claiming of her identity as a covert plurilingual agent and engaging in critical translanguaging in her classroom. So for example, activities like students subverting English text by rewriting them from their own cultural perspectives in multiple languages. And then Clara also speaks to the potential for more resistance to the English-only policy as she becomes more established and less precarious at the school, potentially then becoming an overt plurilingual agent in the context. So to conclude, okay, let's put those slides up. But yeah, just the kind of final point here is that we can see that there's a shift away from strict English-only policies in both contexts, but there's more work to be done insofar as the allowance of other languages, or especially the encouraging of the language. We're not seeing plurilingual or translanguage policies. So, in these two contexts so far. So that's kind of the shift that needs to take place. Thank you so much for listening.